On March 14, 1945, a 19-year-old Marine discovered that changing the angle of attack by 15 feet could mean the difference between total defeat and survival. What Franklin Edward Sigler did that day above a Japanese machine gun nest would not only save his entire company, but would eventually rewrite how the United States Marine Corps thought about confined space warfare. This is the story of how gravity, physics, and one man's refusal to accept failure turned a death trap into a breakthrough. The island of Okinawa in the spring of 1945 was not terrain. It was geology weaponized. Volcanic rock millions of years old had been carved by water and wind into a nightmare of ridges, gorges, and natural fortifications that seemed designed by some malevolent architect specifically to kill Marines. The southern portion of the island, where the main Japanese defensive lines had been established, was a landscape of limestone and volcanic stone that had weathered into a maze of natural caves, some shallow, some extending hundreds of feet into the earth. The Japanese had found these caves, expanded them, connected them, and turned them into a defensive network that was nearly invulnerable to conventional assault. Artillery could pound the surface for hours without touching the men sheltering 30 feet underground. Naval gunfire could obliterate entire hillsides and leave the cave defenders untouched, waiting in the dark with their weapons and their discipline, and their absolute conviction that they would kill as many Americans as possible before they died. The Japanese defenders understood this landscape with the intimacy of men who had spent months preparing to die within it. Every fold in the rock, every cave mouth, every shadow had been surveyed, measured, and integrated into a defensive system that turned American advantages in firepower and manpower into liabilities. The closer you got to a Japanese position, the more likely you were to die. That was the equation. That was the trap. American doctrine emphasized movement, aggression, firepower concentration, and speed. Japanese doctrine emphasized patience, concealment, and the willingness to absorb punishment until the enemy exposed himself, and then to kill him with precision. On Okinawa, in that volcanic maze, Japanese doctrine was winning. Bloody Gorge was a narrow defile cutting through volcanic ridgeline in the southern approaches to what Marines were grimly calling the Shuri Line. It was not particularly long, perhaps 200 yards from entrance to exit, and not especially deep, maybe 40 feet at its lowest point. But it was essential. It had to be crossed. There was no going around it without exposing an entire flank to enfilading fire from higher ground. The gorge was a choke point, and the Japanese knew it. They had positioned a Type 92 heavy machine gun in a cave approximately halfway through the defile, set back from the opening just far enough to be invisible from ground level, but with a field of fire that covered the entire width of the gorge floor. The Type 92 was not like American machine guns. It was a different philosophy of violence. It fired a 7.7mm round at a relatively slow rate, around 450 rounds per minute, but each round was heavy, and it could fire sustained bursts for minutes without overheating. The Japanese had designed it to be fed by metal strips that could be linked indefinitely. In a fixed defensive position with stockpiled ammunition, a Type 92 could fire for hours. It was a weapon built to defend, not to attack, and in that cave it was perfectly employed. Fox Company, 2nd Battalion, 5th Marines had been tasked with clearing Bloody Gorge on the morning of March 14th. Intelligence had reported enemy activity, but had not identified the machine gun position with any precision. The intelligence officers had maps, aerial photographs, and reports from previous patrols, but none of that information revealed what was actually waiting in that gorge. Aerial photographs could not see into cave mouths. Previous patrols had been driven back before they could get close enough to make detailed observations. The Marines were advancing into unknown ground with incomplete information, which is to say they were advancing the way Marines almost always advance. The Marines entered the gorge in a standard advance, riflemen forward, automatic weapons teams behind, moving in a loose column with scouts ahead. The morning was cool. There was mist in the low ground, a thin vapor that clung to the rock and made visibility uncertain beyond 30 yards. The scouts moved carefully, watching for tripwires, for disturbed earth, for any sign of enemy presence. They saw nothing. The first indication that something was wrong came not as sound but as impact. The lead scout simply fell. No crack of a rifle, no warning, just the wet, heavy sound of a bullet striking meat and bone, and the man was down. For a single frozen second, no one moved. Then the machine gun opened fully and the gorge became a killing floor. The sound in that confined space was not loud in the way explosions are loud. It was a deeper, more visceral noise, a mechanical hammering that seemed to come from the rock itself. Marines dove for cover behind boulders into shallow depressions, anywhere that offered even illusory protection. The machine gun was not firing wildly. It was firing in controlled bursts, searching, adjusting, punishing any movement. 3 more men were hit in the first 30 seconds. One was screaming. The others were silent. The company commander pulled the advance back. There was no choice. To stay in the gorge was to die. They withdrew under smoke, dragging the wounded, leaving 1 dead Marine behind because retrieving him would have cost 3 more lives. The smoke grenades produced thick white clouds that provided visual concealment but did nothing to stop bullets. The Japanese gun crew knew the geometry of the gorge and fired into the smoke on pre-calculated azimuths, traversing back and forth, searching for targets they could not see but knew had to be there. 2 more Marines were hit during the withdrawal, 1 in the shoulder, 1 in the foot. Both survived. The company pulled back 200 yards to a covered position behind a rock outcropping and stopped to assess. Back at the rally point, the officers conferred. The problem was obvious. The machine gun had to be destroyed. But how? Direct assault was suicide. The cave opening was too narrow and too well protected for explosives to be delivered by hand from the front. Grenades thrown from ground level either fell short, bounced off rock, or were simply thrown back out by the Japanese crew. 1 Marine had tried exactly that and had been killed by his own grenade when it was tossed back at him with contemptuous efficiency. The same thing had happened on Iwo Jima and on Peleliu and on a dozen other islands. The Japanese were very good at throwing grenades back. They practiced it. They drilled it. They turned American aggression into American casualties with cold, mechanical precision. Artillery was considered but rejected. The cave was too small a target, and the risk of collapsing the gorge entirely and creating an impassable obstacle was too high. Naval gunfire was similarly useless. You cannot shell a hole in a cliff face with any precision. Flamethrowers were discussed. The problem was getting close enough to use one. The machine gun covered every approach. The Marines were stuck. Franklin Edward Sigler was a private. He was 19 years old from Glen Ridge, New Jersey, and he had been in the Pacific for 4 months. Before the war, he had been a student, an athlete, an ordinary young man with an ordinary life. The Marine Corps had taken that ordinary young man and trained him to kill, to endure, to function under conditions that would break most human beings. He was not an officer. He was not a squad leader. He was a rifleman, one of the most junior ranks in the Corps, the kind of Marine who was expected to follow orders, not generate tactical solutions. But Sigler had been watching the attempts to neutralize the cave, and he had been thinking about the problem in a way that was fundamentally different from how his superiors were thinking about it. Everyone else was focused on the horizontal. How do we get close enough? How do we get a grenade inside the cave mouth? How do we suppress the gun long enough to advance? These were the questions trained officers were asking, and they were the wrong questions because they accepted the premise that the attack had to come from the same level as the target. Sigler was thinking about the vertical. He had noticed that the ridge above the cave opening rose steeply but was climbable. He had noticed that the rock face directly above the machine gun position was not sheer but featured ledges and handholds. He had also noticed something else, something critical. The cave was not a single chamber. It was a network. There were multiple openings, some smaller than others, and they were connected internally. He could see this because smoke from American white phosphorus grenades that had been thrown earlier was venting from several different points on the rock face. That meant air was moving through the cave system. That meant the cave was not sealed. And that meant that if you could get above it, if you could find one of those secondary openings, you could drop a grenade straight down into a space where the Japanese could not throw it back out. Sigler did not ask for permission. He informed his squad leader what he was going to do, and before anyone could stop him or order him not to, he moved. He approached the base of the ridge from a covered angle where the machine gun could not traverse, and he began to climb. The rock was sharp. Volcanic stone fractures into edges that can slice through cloth and skin. Sigler climbed with his rifle slung across his back and fragmentation grenades hooked to his belt and chest harness. Each handhold had to be tested. Each foothold had to be secure. A fall from even 10 feet onto volcanic rock could break bones. A fall of 15 feet could be fatal. And if he made noise, if he dislodged a stone, if the Japanese crew inside the cave heard him and understood what he was doing, they could exit the cave, move up the ridge from the interior and shoot him off the cliff face. He climbed in silence. 15 feet above the main cave entrance, Sigler found what he was looking for. A secondary opening, roughly 2 feet in diameter, angled downward into the rock. He could hear voices below him. Japanese voices, calm and professional, the sound of men who believed they were safe. He could smell them. Human bodies in enclosed spaces produce a specific odor, sweat and gun oil and the exhaust from burned powder. He could feel heat rising from the cave, the accumulated warmth of multiple men and a machine gun that had been firing for extended periods. He pulled a fragmentation grenade from his harness. The Mark II fragmentation grenade, called a pineapple for its segmented shell, weighed 1.3 pounds. It had a 4 to 5 second fuse. The killing radius in open air was approximately 5 meters. In a confined stone space, the killing radius was much larger. When a grenade detonates, it produces a blast wave that expands outward at supersonic speed. In open air, that wave dissipates quickly. In a confined space, it cannot dissipate. It reflects off walls. It concentrates. The pressure wave can rupture internal organs even if the fragmentation does not penetrate the body. The Japanese in that cave would not have time to react. They would not have time to throw the grenade back. They would only have time to die. Sigler pulled the pin. He held the grenade for 2 seconds, cooking it, reducing the fuse time so that it would detonate almost immediately after entering the cave. Then he dropped it, not threw it, dropped it. Gravity did the work. The grenade fell vertically, disappeared into the opening, and detonated with a sound that was muffled from outside but which Sigler could feel through the rock beneath his hands. The blast wave traveled up through the secondary opening and hit him in the chest, a physical punch of overpressure that nearly knocked him off the cliff. Inside the cave, the effect was catastrophic. The fragmentation grenade had detonated in an enclosed stone chamber occupied by at least 3 men. The blast wave alone was sufficient to cause severe internal trauma. The fragments, hundreds of them, ricocheted off rock walls at unpredictable angles, turning the cave into a blender of supersonic metal. The machine gun went silent. But Sigler was not finished. He moved along the ridge face, still 15 feet above ground level, searching for other openings. He found one. He dropped another grenade. Another detonation, another wave of pressure, another silence. He found a third opening. He repeated the process. The Japanese defensive position was not a single gun in a single cave. It was a network, a complex, and Sigler was methodically destroying it from above using gravity and physics, and a tactic that no one had taught him because no one had thought of it. He moved with absolute focus. There was no rage in what he was doing. There was no hatred. It was problem-solving under pressure, executed with the precision of an engineer and the commitment of a man who understood that if he failed, his friends would die. On the fourth grenade, something went wrong. As Sigler pulled the pin and cooked the explosive, a Japanese soldier inside the cave system, someone who had survived the previous blasts or who had been positioned in a deeper chamber, fired blindly upward through one of the openings. The bullet hit Sigler in the right thigh. The impact was not like being punched. It was like being struck with a hammer swung at full force. The bullet, a 6.5mm round from a Type 38 rifle, entered the outer thigh, tumbled, and exited through the back of his leg, taking muscle tissue with it. Sigler's leg buckled. He lost his grip. For a fraction of a second, he was falling, and then instinct took over and he grabbed a rock outcropping with his left hand and arrested the fall. He was now hanging from one arm, 15 feet above stone ground, with a bullet wound in his leg and a live grenade in his right hand. He could have dropped the grenade. He could have let it fall and saved himself the additional risk. Instead, he threw it into the opening below him, then pulled himself back up onto the ledge using only his left arm and his uninjured leg. The grenade detonated. The shooting stopped. Sigler descended. Climbing down with a gunshot wound is harder than climbing up. Pain is managed through adrenaline during action, but during controlled movement, pain becomes an opponent. Every shift of weight onto the injured leg produced a white flare of agony that threatened to override rational thought. Blood was running down his leg into his boot. He could feel it, warm and slick. He made it to the ground and immediately moved toward the machine gun cave entrance. Other Marines were advancing now, moving up through the gorge because the fire had stopped. They found Sigler at the cave mouth, rifle raised, covering the opening. Inside were bodies. The Type 92 heavy machine gun was intact but unmanned. The crew was dead. The cave smelled like burned meat and explosive residue. Sigler did not enter. He turned and saw wounded Marines further back in the gorge. Men who had been hit during the initial assault and who had been pinned down by machine gun fire, unable to be evacuated. Without being ordered, without being asked, Sigler moved toward them. Over the next 2 hours, Franklin Sigler, bleeding from a gunshot wound to the thigh, helped evacuate 8 wounded Marines from Bloody Gorge. He did not carry them alone. He coordinated with other riflemen, organizing stretcher teams, directing movement, providing covering fire whenever Japanese snipers from other positions took shots at the evacuation effort. He fired his M1 Garand rifle from behind cover, reloading with the methodical efficiency of someone who understood that panic kills and that discipline saves. His leg was not functioning correctly. The muscle damage was severe enough that he could not put full weight on it. He moved in a crouch, using his rifle as a crutch at times, and he did not stop moving until every wounded Marine was out of the gorge. Only then did he allow himself to be evacuated. Only then did he sit down, and only then did the pain truly arrive, not as a flare but as a totality, and he passed out. Fox Company advanced through Bloody Gorge without further casualties. The loss of the Type 92 machine gun position broke the Japanese defensive line at that point. The gorge was cleared by nightfall. The Marines moved forward. The battle for Okinawa continued for another 2.5 months and cost the lives of more than 12,000 American servicemen. But Fox Company survived March 14th because one 19-year-old private looked up instead of forward and understood that elevation changes everything. The Medal of Honor citation for Franklin Edward Sigler, issued later that year, describes his actions in the formal language of military commendations. It mentions his grenade attacks and his courage under fire. It does not fully capture the tactical innovation. It does not describe the physics of confined blast spaces or the geometric problem of attacking a fortified position from an unexpected vector. It does not explain that what Sigler did was not just brave, which it was, but also smart, which is rarer and more valuable. Bravery without intelligence often results in heroic death. Intelligence without courage results in nothing. Sigler possessed both, and he used them to solve a problem that had stumped officers with years of experience. In the months and years following the Battle of Okinawa, the United States Marine Corps began to formally incorporate vertical assault tactics into its doctrine for cave warfare. Field manuals were updated. Training programs were revised. Marines began to be taught to look for elevated positions when confronting fortified bunkers and cave defenses, to consider grenade attacks from above, to use terrain in 3 dimensions rather than 2. Some of this would have happened anyway. Doctrine evolves through experience, but the speed and specificity with which these changes were implemented can be traced directly to after-action reports from Okinawa, and those reports referenced Sigler's actions as a case study. A 19-year-old private, acting on intuition and observation, had demonstrated a principle that became codified knowledge. That is rare. Most battlefield innovations are lost, forgotten in the chaos, attributed to no one, absorbed into the collective without acknowledgement. Sigler's innovation survived because it worked, because it was witnessed, and because it saved lives in a measurable and undeniable way. Franklin Sigler survived the war. He returned to New Jersey. He received the Medal of Honor from President Harry Truman in a ceremony at the White House on October 5, 1945. Photographs from that day show a young man, thin, serious, uncomfortable in his dress uniform, standing next to the President of the United States and looking like he would rather be anywhere else. There is no smile. There is no triumph in his expression. He looks tired. Men who have killed other men up close, who have seen friends die, who have been shot, and who have bled into volcanic rock, do not smile easily. Sigler lived a long life after the war. He died in 2014 at the age of 87. In interviews given late in his life, he spoke about Bloody Gorge in simple terms. He said he saw a problem and he solved it. He said he did what needed to be done. He did not describe himself as a hero. He described himself as a Marine who had a job to do. What happened on that ridgeline above Bloody Gorge matters not because it was extraordinary, though it was, but because it was replicable. Sigler did not perform magic. He did not accomplish something beyond the capacity of other men. He simply thought differently under pressure and acted on that thought with commitment and precision. That is teachable. That is transferable. That is the difference between an isolated act of valor and a genuine contribution to the art of war. Valor is individual. Doctrine is collective. Sigler's actions bridged that gap. He turned personal courage into institutional knowledge, and in doing so, he likely saved the lives of Marines he never met in battles he never fought. The Type 92 heavy machine gun that Sigler neutralized is not in a museum. The cave at Bloody Gorge was not preserved. Okinawa has moved on. The island is peaceful now, densely populated, modern, unrecognizable from the hellscape it was in 1945. The rock is still there. The gorges are still there. But the war is gone, survived only in memory and in the lessons that were learned at such terrible cost. Franklin Sigler climbed 15 feet and changed the equation. He used gravity as a weapon. He understood that the shortest distance between 2 points is not always a straight line, and sometimes the best way forward is up. That insight, born in desperation and executed under fire, is worth remembering not because it glorifies war, which it does not, but because it illustrates a fundamental truth about human beings under pressure. We adapt. We innovate. We solve problems even when the cost of failure is death. And sometimes, if we are lucky and disciplined and willing to take risks that terrify us, we survive. If you found this story valuable, please consider subscribing to this channel and sharing it with others who appreciate military history told with accuracy and respect. Leave a like if this narrative gave you a new perspective on the Pacific War. And here is a question worth considering as you reflect on Franklin Sigler's actions that day. In modern warfare, where technology and firepower dominate tactical thinking, how much room is left for individual innovation on the battlefield? And does the kind of problem-solving Sigler demonstrated still matter? Or has war become too complex and too mechanized for a single soldier to change the outcome of an engagement through insight alone? Share your thoughts below.